Hey guys, Zane here with another One Take review, and today I wanted to talk about the Mars Volta's new self-titled album. It has been a full decade since the Mars Volta's last full-length studio album, 2012's Nocturnicate, and ever since then, the band behind classic records like Francis the Mute and Deloused in the Comatorium have been mostly AWOL outside of a handful of singles here or there, or maybe some unreleased music finally coming to light, but now, 10 years after the fact of their last studio album, they're finally back with another full-length release, and even though it always kind of seemed like it was destiny that another Mars Volta album was going to be disappointing, after all, it's hard to match up with really iconic records that defined rock music throughout the 2000s and even the early 2010s, this is somehow even more disappointing than it seemed like it was going to be in the first place. As any extended period of time will do to any band, the 10 years since Mars Volta's last studio album has seen a lot of change for the band musically, and that's pretty understandable. In fact, I would actually argue that the Mars Volta's new self-titled album is the most immediately accessible record that they've ever produced in their entire existence. I'm not saying it's the best that they've ever done, and actually, in fact, as you'll see in a moment, it's probably the worst, but it's definitely the most accessible overall, as the artsy pop rock nature of the record that is featured on every single track here, just about, is going to be mostly unfamiliar to pre-established fans of the Mars Volta. With this comes the inevitable question of, can the Mars Volta do this sound well? And the ultimate answer is, generally speaking anyways, no, they cannot, because although they could have done something interesting with this sonic aesthetic, after all, they are a fairly forward-thinking progressive rock band at heart, they simply lack the passion needed to be superior to many younger, also alternative rock bands doing similar sounds with more passion and fire. The latest Mars Volta album was meant to appeal to a wider audience, which makes sense and it's respectable artistically and certainly respectable from a monetary standpoint, but at the same time it also kind of doesn't make sense because who's really looking to see the Mars Volta hit the mainstream? It's been decades since they first debuted. It's kind of at the point where they have an established fan base and it's better off trying to please them. I mean, if you're going to make a passionless effort like this, you might as well make something basic and expected for the Mars Volta instead of something passionless and obviously a cash grab for something that is a different audience and a different niche than what people expect from you. The few experiments that the band managed to take on do end up being kind of fruitless overall, if I'm being totally honest. For example, the Latin influences that are brought about via Willie Quinones' drumming are too insignificant to play any sort of integral role. The electronic influences on songs like No Case Gain just simply are obnoxious more than anything else, and the semi-balladry that's not exactly powerful or poignant emotionally, but not super fun or generally enjoyable that you can enjoy it without thinking, feels like a throwback to sounds from decades past that don't need to be revisited whatsoever. I'm not using these examples to sort of provide quality reasoning for why the Mars Volta are the risk-taking types on their latest studio album, because they're not the risk-taking types here. That's just simply not true. But when they do kind of dip their toes into the pool of experimentation, they end up slipping and then falling into the pool and then drowning and leaving nothing of substance. This record feels very thin, and this goes in more ways than one, and that can definitely be at least partially credited to Marcel Rodriguez Lopez's mixing, which ultimately just doesn't allow any of the individual instrumentalists of the Mars Volta to shine, while still ensuring that vocalist Cedric Bixler-Zavala sounds very muffled. The aforementioned frontman's lack of enthusiasm certainly doesn't help either, but the point still stands. The production is largely to blame for a fairly compressed and overall just lifeless sound on this record. Even the record itself conceptually feels about as thoughtless as it gets, because there is certainly an air of certainty about the Mars Volta and what they want to do on this album. It's just that they take a lot of different ideas, like I said before, those Latin influences, those electronic influences, and proceed to not fully flesh them out or even barely do anything with them, leaving this record with nothing but a batch of songs that, despite their status as complete, feel remarkably unfinished. So overall, the Mars Volta's first album in 10 years fails to live up to even half of the expectations that it had behind it. You could definitely argue that another Mars Volta album was never going to live up to anybody's expectations. I mean, after all, they're a legendary band, and there's no denying that either. That is an undeniable fact. The Mars Volta are legends at this point. The Loust in the Comatorium is considered one of the best albums of the 2000s, for God's sake. But nonetheless, it does feel like they could have done something more, because this just feels like a lifeless outing from a band that shouldn't be putting out music this week at this point in their career. I'm going to give this record 1.5 stars out of 5. My one take on this album is that between adapting a sonic aesthetic that simply doesn't work and working with a handful of experimentations that feel weak, thin, and poorly executed overall, the Mars Volta managed to disappoint about as much as they possibly could with their first album in quite some time. So again, 1.5 stars out of 5, and with that being said, that's the end of this review, and I'll see you guys in the next one.